So welcome back. This is part 2 of Monday's makeup lecture. If you have not seen part 1 yet, I'm not sure how you skipped it, but be sure to go back and read that first and watch that video, otherwise you're going to be completely lost. So last lecture, both in the classroom and the first video, we talked about the organizational levels of biology. As a quick recap, we have the biosphere. This is referring to Earth itself, thinking about global changes and global patterns that affect organisms everywhere. Going the next level down, we talked about ecosystems. Ecosystems are both the abiotic, the non-living, and the biotic components of a region. So think about deserts. Very similar weather and climate. The organisms that live in a desert, for example, camels, you don't see those in the rainforest. They're located in that ecosystem. So we care about those organisms such as fish, but we also care about their abiotic or surrounding environment such as the ocean. That ocean water is not living, but it is important to life, particularly for that fish. Going the next level down to communities, this is just biotic factors, just the living components of an ecosystem. So the example we used before was the Serengeti, looking at those zebras and those wildebeests and those grasses. We no longer are really paying attention to temperature or sunlight or water, those abiotic factors. We really just care about how these living organisms interact with one another. We then talked about populations. Now we're focusing on just a single species and all the organisms in that species, thinking about a lion's pride, or you could even think if you have lots of dogs at home, all of those dogs. They're all the same species, and so now we care about the interactions between individuals. And then finally, where we left off was talking about an individual organism. So you think about that tree. What are the mechanics of that tree that allow it to get water from its roots all the way to the top of its trunk to its leaves? So we care about those individual questions. Now the next thing that we're going to talk about is thinking about these multicellular organisms and how can we classify organisms. Some of these terms will probably be familiar to you. So one way that we can classify organisms is really how do they obtain their energy. So the first group, and pretty much the most important group, at least in my opinion, are the producers. The reason they're so important is because without producers, there wouldn't be life on Earth. We as humans couldn't live, even if you don't eat producers, if you don't eat lettuce or tomatoes or any kind of fruit or vegetable. Even if you don't eat any of those foods, whatever you do eat, cows, chickens, pork, eat producers. All of our energy stems from these producers. Now these producers get all of their energy from the sun. Take a moment and thinking about solar energy, thinking about that light energy. Is that part of the open system or the closed system? Right, it's part of the open system. That is one of the very few things on Earth that we don't recycle. We have to get a continuous supply of the solar energy from the sun. And that's what producers are. These are organisms such as this tree or grass, or really most things that you can think of that are green. They get their energy from the sun. Another example, you've probably seen this on the top of ponds or maybe slow-moving rivers. Some people call it pond scum. People don't think of this as an organism. This organism is called phytoplankton. Phyto referring to plant, and then plankton referring to a small aquatic organism. You'll see phytoplankton quite a few times really in this entire class. So just know I'm referring to essentially sea plants. Now I said that these producers, these plants, are getting their energy from the sun. And that process of using that energy is called photosynthesis. And you might have heard this before. You might have heard the process of photosynthesis. And really think about what plants need. If you have a plant in your house, what do you give it? Well, one thing, you need to water it. If you don't water it, it's going to die. If you put it in a closet, it's also going to die because you're lacking sunlight. And remember, for plants, sunlight is that source of energy. If you don't give them sunlight, you're not giving them energy. Now, something else that plants need that is kind of invisible to us but surrounds us is carbon dioxide. So let's look at all three of those individually. So we'll start with carbon dioxide. You also may have seen this written as CO2. This C stands for carbon. The O stands for oxygen, which is that oxide. And then di is a prefix meaning to. Now this is in the air all around us. We actually exhale it as well, and all organisms exhale carbon dioxide. So plants are really useful in the sense that they take carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. We know that plants also need water. H2O is the same thing as water. This is just the chemical formula, H referring to hydrogen and again O referring to oxygen. We'll talk more about these individual elements in the next unit. So the last ingredient needed is light energy. Again, this is part of the open system. We don't have light energy recycling on Earth because we get all of it from the sun. And plants are very fortunate because they get to use this light energy as an actual source of energy. Most plants, there are some exceptions, but most plants don't eat anything. They have to get all of their food from the sun. Now, I mentioned before that photosynthesis takes place in the leaves. Now, specifically, the reason it takes place in the leaves is because the cells of a leaf have these very specialized structures. Inside of a leaf cell, and I'll show you what this looks like on the next slide, inside of these leaf cells are chloroplasts. Now, chloroplast, a little structure, and that's what this image is showing here. This chloroplast has a pigment in it. Pigment, think of that as a coloring. This pigment is called chlorophyll. So this chlorophyll is what's actually capturing this light energy. If a plant had no chlorophyll, then it wouldn't be able to capture any of that light energy. So let's just take a focus in on these chloroplasts. So each of these block structures that you're seeing, that I'm outlining here, that is a plant cell. And all of those small little circles in it are chloroplasts. So you can see one plant cell has tons and tons of chloroplasts. Now the chloroplasts are green. The reason they're green is because they have this pigment. They have this chlorophyll pigment. And chlorophyll is green. So that's actually what gives plants its green color, is that chlorophyll pigment. Now with humans, we also have a pigment, not chlorophyll, we have melanin. Melanin is our pigment. Melanin is brown. More melanin you have, the darker you are. Same thing with plants. The more chlorophyll you have, the greener you are. So chlorophyll are located in these chloroplasts, these individual dots you see here, and that's where photosynthesis takes place. These chloroplasts are taking in that carbon dioxide, they're getting water delivered to them, and that chlorophyll is working on their side, gathering all of that light energy. So now we have all the ingredients we need to start photosynthesizing, to start taking that solar energy and kind of using it into a form that's a little bit more useful for both the plant and for all of us. So here's the same exact slide. We have our carbon dioxide, our light energy, and our water inputs. They are put into our chloroplast. That chlorophyll is capturing that light energy, and then out comes two different products, both useful for us as humans and other animals. The first product, and probably the most important product, is glucose, the C6H12O6. It is okay if you do not memorize that chemical formula. but you do need to know this is glucose. Glucose is a sugar. A little different from the sugar you use in baking, but a sugar nonetheless. Now this sugar, it's not like these plants are, dropping drips of sugar or having crystal sugars everywhere. Instead, those sugars are incorporated into the plant. Just like when we eat food, it helps us grow. Same thing with this glucose. This glucose and this solar energy are helping these plants grow. So these plants will grow taller, they'll grow more leaves, maybe they'll flower, get more roots. So that's where that glucose goes. So don't think it's just, letting out the sugar into the environment. But this is also good for us because when we eat plants, or the cows or the chickens eat plants, they're eating that glucose. So that's a great energy source. This is chemical energy, this energy that we can take in. Now, the other thing that plants release is oxygen, or this O2, O standing for oxygen. Now, this oxygen is released by the plant. Glucose isn't, but oxygen is. So oxygen is just let out because plants see that as a waste product. Plants don't need it to grow. They need that carbon dioxide. They don't need the oxygen. So they release oxygen as a waste product. Although it's the waste of the plant, incredibly crucial for us. We cannot live if there wasn't any oxygen. The reason we have any life on Earth is because the first organisms on Earth were plants. And then they increased the oxygen in our atmosphere to allow organisms like humans to evolve and to grow and to even have the ability to live. Now, thinking about oxygen, here's that word phytoplankton again. Half of all the oxygen in the world is produced by phytoplankton. These are those small little plants that are in the ponds, they're in oceans and rivers. So although we don't even see them most of the time, they actually produce half of our oxygen. The other half of our oxygen is produced by land plants. So thinking about the tree in your backyard or going to a park. But most of the trees are actually in the tropics. So next time you see plants or you see that pond scum and think it's disgusting, you should actually thank it. It's providing all of this oxygen to us. Now this formula that just popped in at the bottom, same exact thing that we went over, but I have it written in a chemical sense. So we have carbon dioxide plus water, so CO2 plus H2O plus light energy or solar energy. That yields or that creates glucose, the C6H12O6 plus oxygen. Now on the test, if I ask you, what is the formula for photosynthesis? You could give me this chemical formula at the bottom, or you could write out all of these different components. Either one is perfectly correct. Now we're going to stop here and take a pause before we start the next one. So we just talked about producers. Well, now I want to talk about organisms such as us who can't produce our own food. So review your notes and then begin part 3.